food, drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content.
It's an absolute pleasure to speak to you, Nick. Thank you.
Do you want to just start off by telling everyone a little bit about your academic background and what your training looks like as it informs the book that you're coming out with?
Yeah, of course. So I mean, academically, so I started out, I was an historian as an undergraduate. I did postgraduate work then in anthropology and social anthropology. And then I did my PhD at Oxford. I was at Cambridge before that. I did my PhD at Oxford in medieval history. So I'm a medievalist, historian, anthropologist by training, but I'm also I mean I'm famous as the or semi-famous, infamous, whatever you want to call it, as the raw egg nationalist. Writing about health and fitness in particular, politics, culture, the kind of intersection of all of these things. I mean, I've had a lifelong interest in health and fitness and sport. You know, as a sportsman, as a child and teenager at school, and I've kept myself in good shape ever since. So my background's actually pretty diverse, but then the book itself actually I think really is quite diverse, and it mixes a lot of different topics, and is quite different from a lot of the books on sort of masculinity that you'd find on the market today.
Yeah. No. The book is interesting. It came to me recently, and it's an interesting synthesis of science, hormone biology, diet, together with things like
Mm.
politics, philosophy, and so forth. So you cover a lot of ground here in 200 pages or so. One of the concepts you introduced early on, I think, is informed by your background in medieval history and languages. It's the concept of thymos, which comes, I believe, from the ancient Greeks. So, what is this
Yes.
concept, and what does it what did it mean to them, and what does it maybe mean for us today?
So it's I mean, the ancient Greeks were very, very astute, I think, observers of human nature. And thymos is basically a kind of biological, psychological concept. Um, it's a moral concept as well. And what it basically means is something like spiritedness. So thymos is kind of this kind of set of attributes, of virtues, of dispositions, whatever you want to call them, that kind of rooted in biology that animates man and particularly men to be spirited. So Plato, for example, I think in the Republic, talks about thymos as making men like a sort of like a fearsome dog. You know, like a man becomes like a fearsome dog defending his city. That's thymos that drives man to do that. And there are particular sort of sub-variants or different kinds of thymos that the Greeks talk about. But I mean, I draw my use of the term mainly from Francis Fukuyama, the famous kind of philosopher, social theorist, whatever you call him, who wrote The End of History and The Last Man, which is this book that he was very famous for writing at the end of the Cold War, where he talks about thymos as the desire for recognition. That's how he describes it. It's thymos is what drives people to seek, and men in particular, to seek different kinds of recognition. So, on the one hand, there's what he calls, and what the ancient Greeks called isothymia, which is a desire to be seen as equal with one's peers. And that's one of the sort of foundational, I suppose, drives that is satisfied by democracy, by modern liberal democracy, is this demand to be recognized as equal. But then there's another kind of thymos called megalothymia, which is the desire to be, well, the desire to seek distinction and the desire to be recognized as better than one's peers. So that's slightly different. That's a different kind of desire for recognition, where rather than just wanting to have the same rights and to be recognized as equal with all your peers, you actually want to be recognized as better because you are, perhaps,
Mhm, mhm.
because you're have greater physical capabilities, or because you have greater intellectual capabilities, or whatever, or both,
Mhm,
or
mhm.
various different things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Thymos is this kind of yeah, it's like an animating set of drives and dispositions that that push man to strive in particular ways. That's like a basic I suppose, kind of nutshell. That's Thymos in a nutshell,
Yeah,
really.
yeah, yeah. And so these are two different but related things, and I think we can all relate to this at an intuitive level.
Mm,
Everyone wants to be part of the group, part of the crew. We want to
mm,
belong. We don't want to be exiled or ostracized. Humans are very
mm,
sensitive to that. We want to be seen as co-equals with others in that way. At the same time, everyone does seek distinction. We want to fit into some kind of niche and be, known
mm.
for something or contribute something unique from others to the group. And so these two things can exist to different degrees, I would imagine, in different societies and individuals. You mentioned Francis Fukuyama. Many listening to this podcast may not know who he is, but why don't you briefly state, because his work is sort of central to what your book
Mm.
is about. Who was Fukuyama, and what is this concept of the end of history that's attached to his name?
Yeah, so Francis Fukuyama is a kind of political theorist, philosopher. He became very famous at the end of the Cold War. In 1989, he wrote an essay called The End of History, where he basically, I mean, he's like he was kind of informed by by Hegel's notion of historical progress through kind of dialectical movement between opposing um, principles in society and history more broadly. But he wrote this essay called "The End of History." I can't remember which journal it was in, but it was in quite a big journal, and it kicked up a big fuss. Where he basically said that the fall of the Soviet Union, the coming down of the Berlin Wall, was the end of history with a capital H. Now, his argument has been much sort of parodied and misunderstood. What he was really saying was that kind of history had ended. We'd ended up in this situation with a kind of final political synthesis. There are alternative, no really viable alternative political systems to liberal democracy, to liberal capitalism. Right. So liberal capitalism has triumphed over communism, and we've arrived at this sort of end stage of history where actually there's no further movement for evolution of the political form. Like this is
Mhm,
the best that we can do in political and social terms is to have a liberal democracy.
mhm. That would be so the idea would be, in the war of ideas, liberal democracy beat communism and other ideologies. And this will be the new steady state. People will live and die, stuff
Yeah,
will happen, but it will be in
yeah,
this general liberal democratic form.
right, exactly. Yeah. So he's not saying like time has stopped or
Mhm,
anything like that. He's just saying, look, like, you know, human societies follow this path, and they end up at liberal democracy in the end. That's the kind of triumphant system, and we can't go beyond that. So he wrote that as an essay in '89, and then he turned that into a book in I think '90 or '91, The End of History and the Last Man, and that really kind of so I mean my book is about masculinity. It's called The Last Men, Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity, and it's a it's an entry in this sort of broader literature about the decline of masculinity. So you have all sorts of different people like Jordan Peterson, Richard Reeves, who wrote a book called Of Boys and Men. It's quite a big topic now. What's happened to masculinity? Why aren't men men anymore? Why are young men dropping out of university and school?
mhm, mhm.
Why are they dropping out of society more broadly?
Yeah.
Why aren't men dating? Why aren't men sort of pursuing women anymore? All sorts of, all of these sort of related kind of
Yeah.
trends that all suggest that actually, there is this kind of fundamental crisis for men in the modern Western
Yeah,
world.
yeah. There's many
And
different takes on this, of course, and many,
mm,
but it's clear, right? There's something major happening. Men and women are
yeah,
behaving differently than they once did in many different ways. Men in particular seem to be dropping out in various ways that we can
mm,
talk about that we'll probably get to. And
yeah.
you just have you have your particular take on this, which even though we're starting out the discussion on the philosophy and theory side
Mm.
here, it actually is rooted in biology and hormones.
Yes, yes. So, I mean, what I'm trying to do really is I'm drawing together quite a lot of different threads. So we've got this philosophical account of modernity from an historical account of modernity from Fukuyama, where he talks about um, the triumph of liberal democracy, but he frames it in terms of Thymos. So he talks about, and this is the part of the book actually that gets lost, is that although people remember the end of history stuff, the stuff that they can parody very easily, where they say, "Oh, Francis Fukuyama, he was that guy who thought that history came to an end when the Berlin Wall came down." Um, but the full title of the book is actually The End of History and the Last Man. And the final quarter of the book is about this last man. Now, who is the last man? The last man is this creature first described by Nietzsche.
Hmm.
He is the kind of he's like a kind of degenerated man who only kind of sort of emerges in modernity with the death of God, with the triumph of industrial capitalism. You get this kind of person who is like not really good for anything other than consuming,
Hmm.
basically. He's like a shadow of what a man really ought to be. He's like has no high aspirations, no goals, doesn't
Yeah,
believe
yeah,
in anything, just consumes products that are
yeah.
created for him by other people.
Yeah, it's
Um,
striking.
uh,
It's striking. Nietzsche was writing about that, well over a century ago, and
mm,
yet we can immediately call to mind, the
mm.
25-year-old in his mother's basement who just plays video games.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you've got other people as well at the time writing about very similar things. Dostoevsky, for example,
Hmm.
if you read Notes from the Underground or Notes from Underground, I mean that's like the first incel novel. It's an incredible first person kind of account of this kind of crepuscular existence, basement dwelling kind of existence, really driven by resentment and a kind of lack of identification with any kind of real morality or values or anything like that. Totally unmoored, directionless, resentful, spiteful, all this kind of stuff. But yeah, so I mean, so Francis Fukuyama is presented as a triumphalist, right? He's presented as the kind of hubristic, almost like the most kind of hubristic representative of liberal democracy, and he's the great champion of liberal democracy. He thinks it's amazing. Well, actually, no. He actually presents the victory of liberal democracy as a kind of hollow victory, where he says, "Look, like we've ended up with this political form that's triumphed over all of the others, but actually." It can't satisfy many of man's most fundamental needs, wants, and desires. So this is where Thymos comes in. So with liberal democracy, you can satisfy man's isothymia, which is the desire to be recognized as equal. So we all participate in liberal democracy as equals. But what it can't satisfy, which previous political systems could, is megalothymia, is this desire for something more, the desire to be better, the desire to strive to be better than others, to assert yourself, and not just be part of the herd. Um, so that's the kind of philosophical background that or the framework that I'm trying to fit my account of, let's say, the crisis of masculinity into. But what I do from there is I say, well, actually, look, if you look at thymos and in particular behaviors associated with megalothymia, that's actually it's testosterone basically. Thymos, I think, in many respects, is a proxy, is a kind of philosophical, psychological, biological proxy for talking about testosterone and the kinds of behaviors that testosterone uh, makes men prone to, makes
Hmm.
the things it makes men do. And so what I'm really trying to do, I suppose, is to say that actually, the crisis of masculinity, this kind of decline in masculine behavior, is a biological crisis. It's a crisis of Thymos and it's a crisis of testosterone in particular. And that's a very different emphasis, I think, from a lot of the literature. Now, I'm not saying that all of it is testosterone, and in fact, what I'm saying is that actually, you know, there are environmental issues and there are all sorts of issues on the biological level, but there's also an issue with the political system itself, as described by Fukuyama, which is that actually it only allows a particular narrow vision of thymotic behavior,
Hmm.
basically. So, you can be equal, but you can't be better. And actually, testosterone is associated with behaviors that make us competitive, that make us strive, that make us want to assert ourselves over others. And so there's this whole dimension of masculine behavior and of masculine striving and wanting that just can't be satisfied, I think, within liberal democracy. So it's like my fundamental emphasis is biological, but it's also political, it's also historical, it's also philosophical.
Hmm.
Which I think is what makes it very different from other kind of entries in the kind of crisis of masculinity sort of literature.
Yeah, and one of the things that's lurking here that I want to bring out for people is something that's
Mm.
it's axiomatic in the West, at least that's where I'm speaking from. So that's a perspective I can speak about. It's something that we take for granted, which is dualism. People
Yes.
tend to think that the realm of the mind and the realm of the body are two separate things,
Mm.
two separate substances, however you want to put it. The spirit world and the physical world are separate, and that's been around for a long time. And many people just sort of
Mm.
implicitly act and believe as if this type of thing is true. Your spirit or
Yes.
your mind, your consciousness is separate from your body. But the perspective you take here and emphasizes that no, these things they're all integrated as one, that the mind body is one unit, and you can't have a deterioration of mind or spiritedness or social tendencies without having something going on the biological side. How do you sort of think about the dualistic nature of people's
Mm.
thinking in the West generally, and where does that actually come from?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that's a very good really summation of what I'm trying to get at. Um, so I mean the source of the mind body dualism, where does it come from? Well, I mean, fairly recently, in the sort of beginning of the modern period, we have someone like Descartes, the René Descartes, the French philosopher, who famously uh, entered into this sort of radical skepticism in order to find the basis of knowledge and of belief and of certainty about the world, the cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, right? And so he, after doing this sort of radical thought experiment about, what can I be, what is the basis of knowledge, he came to the conclusion that it was just the certainty that you are a thinking thing, basically. So that's one source, definitely, of I think modernity's dualism in particular, is this belief that actually at base, there is this thinking matter that is totally separate. There's this thinking thing that is totally separate from matter. Hard division between the two. But I think if you push back further in time, then you would probably look at things like the Christian conception of the soul, for
Right,
example,
right.
the enduring soul, that lives on beyond death, that
Hmm.
is
There's this
somehow.
thing that possesses the body that is it
Yes.
possesses it, but it's not of it.
No, exactly. And also kind of that is you. You are the soul.
Yeah.
You have this temporary sort of meat marionette or meat machine that you inhabit. But actually you are an immaterial thing. You're an immaterial essence in some sense. So I think really we're pushing back thousands of years, really. I think this is a deep tendency in Western thought, Western philosophy, Western theology, religion, But when we get back to the ancients, when we get back to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, we start to see a different conception, I think, of the relationship between mind and body. So you have this very, very famous dictum, mens sana in corpore sano, healthy mind in a healthy body. It's a sense that you are an integrated whole. The two, whatever the two things are, and maybe you could say there's even a division back then. Nevertheless, there's a sense that they are integrated, perhaps in a way that we have over time forgotten. And people do, I think, today behave as if you can be a healthy person if you mentally, if you have an unhealthy lifestyle. We don't tend, when we look at, I think, mental diseases, for example, and mental instability, depression, all these kinds of things, we tend not to look at the body, perhaps,
Hmm. Hmm.
in a way that the ancients would. It would have been, I think, very obvious to an ancient person that, somebody sitting around all day eating junk, not moving, is overweight, is probably going to be mentally unhappy as well. But actually, for for modern physicians and for ordinary people, then it's just a sort of like, oh, well, it's imbalances in the brain, or it's something like that. There's no kind of deeper sense of an integration between the physical and the mental.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so I mean, it's a pervasive tendency, I think, and certainly, within this literature about the kind of crisis of masculinity, then what you really get is you get people talking about, they'll talk about values, and they'll talk about, let's say, like structural problems. They'll talk about, the way that workplaces are structured now. They'll talk about, the education system. They'll talk about cultural values, and, like the we live in a culture that promotes, let's say, different alternative vision of masculinity to the traditional patriarchal vision of masculinity. But very few people will touch on the biology. Very few people will actually, beyond, for example, so someone like Richard Reeves, who wrote Of Boys and Men, which is an attempt to argue, I think, the case for masculinity, or a particular vision of masculinity. Uh, you know, he'll talk about testosterone, but only very briefly, just to say, look, um, men have testosterone and it doesn't make them bad. Testosterone doesn't just well, actually, what he says is we aren't governed by our hormones. That's what he's trying to
Hmm.
say, basically. Uh, but which I think is very wrong, actually. And I do say in the book, look, uh, we are our hormones in a very, very fundamental way. And
Right. The
if
the
you
du the
witness,
dualistic thing is lurking there
mm,
in that type of statement.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yes, it is. Yeah, it comes back again and again. It's sort of like, actually, we can radically divorce ourselves from our biology, and these big aggregate changes, and we can talk about the big aggregate changes, to testosterone levels. They don't really matter, like either way, it doesn't matter if testosterone levels are going off a cliff, because all we need to do actually is have the right social structures in place and the right values, and,
Hmm.
men can be men again. Well, I'm not entirely sure about that. I think it's more complicated than that. Obviously, you have to structure society in the right way, and that's why I talk about Fukuyama. That's why
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
take the
Yeah.
framing from Fukuyama, because I think that, we've created a particular kind of system that actually doesn't even allow fundamental expressions of masculinity to take place.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we'll come to some of this, but my background is in neuroendocrinology, and
Mm,
point blank, the perspective you just articulated from the other guy just doesn't make a lot of sense. We know that
no.
changing hormones is sufficient to change the behavior of animals. It will change their
Mm,
orientation to other animals. And, when we
yep.
talk about humans, that's going to have consequences and implications for
Mm,
social structures and the type of social structures that people will fit
mm,
into well or want. And
yeah.
then the influence goes in the other direction as well. This is a bi-directional thing. The social
Mm,
relations one has, the structures in place that
yeah.
mold and bias, how you interact with fellow humans, it's going to have hormonal effects as well. With this stuff in mind, I want to get into some of the hormone biology here. And I want to start
Mm,
with testosterone and what it does, and really emphasize misconceptions that are out there about how testosterone and other sex hormones work. I think one of the cartoons that people often have in their mind around testosterone is, okay, testosterone is high in men, estrogen's high in women. Sometimes they forget that both are critically important at precise
yes.
ratios in both of the sexes. And then the cartoon for testosterone in particular is, oh, testosterone promotes aggression and bad
Hmm.
behavior, basically. What do we
Yes.
know about the behavioral effects of high and low testosterone in humans and other animals?
Yeah, well, I mean, so we get our understanding of testosterone from a variety of different sources, you know. I mean, in the book, I go into the kind of deep history of endocrinology, the study of hormones, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, the first the first experiments in endocrinology were castration in the ancient world, and we know that castration has a deep, deep history. Not only castration of animals, bulls for domestication, geldings, etc., but also castration of humans, slaves, eunuchs in harems, um, just in war as a punishment. So, I mean, humans have had an understanding that there is something in the male testes that governs male behavior and that it can be manipulated by the kind of gross, blunt act actually of just severing the testes or indeed the entire, male genitalia, penis as well. Um, like we've had a kind of blunt understanding of something that there's some kind of substance, some kind of thing that governs masculinity that originates in the testes for a long time, even if we, obviously weren't able to articulate it as hormones
Mm-hmm.
or as a particular hormone. And it was only really at the end of the 19th century and then in the early 20th century, in the 1930s, that the actual substance that was then called testosterone was first isolated and its effects started to be studied. This was the 1930s. Uh, and then you had the first synthetic testosterone that was made in the late 1930s. That's basically the beginning of the age of doping as well. That's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when steroids are first created. That's a kind of watershed in endocrinology as well. But so we had this kind of deep understanding of testosterone as a hormone, even though we didn't know what it was. But then more recently, then we have all sorts of experiments. So we have experiments with animals in the lab and in the wild, in other settings, in zoos and observational studies. And then we have studies of human beings as well, and people who take testosterone therapy. And actually, what we really have now is we have a much more nuanced view of what testosterone is and does. And yes, testosterone is involved in the regulation of aggression. And that's like you say, that's the real stereotype of testosterone is, you roid rage, you
Right,
have too
right.
much testosterone, you're a pro wrestler, you're gonna go home and murder your family. I mean, it's like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
roid rage, testosterone, whatever. It makes you aggressive, it makes you masculine, it makes you uncontrollable, it makes you antisocial, it makes you a thoroughly unpleasant human being. And so, of course, a regular refrain that you will hear is, society would be better with less testosterone. And so, any news of lowering testosterone levels is also is welcomed, because it's like, oh, we're all getting more civilized. And actually there actually is evidence, long-term anthropological evidence, skeletal evidence that suggests that actually maybe the dawn of civilization was actually associated with some kind of reduction in testosterone levels among men. So if you look at hunter-gatherer skeletons from about 50,000 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and then, 30, 40,000, 20,000, 10,000 years ago, what you see is what's basically called something like faciocranial masculinization decreases. So what that
Yeah,
basically means is that like brow ridges
yeah.
become
The
less prominent, the
robustness of the
head.
skull.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that's generally taken as an indication that actually testosterone levels were declining, from 50,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, the dawn of civilization. And paleo-archaeologists and anthropologists hypothesize, well, maybe this was associated with the move from smaller bands of hunter-gatherers to more complex, larger agricultural societies, where actually cooperation and intimacy, larger numbers of people living together, requires, let's say, like greater cooperation and so less testosterone. Now, I mean, that's the hypothetical. That is a hypothetical. I mean, we don't, it's one of these just so stories that we
Right,
can
right. Yeah.
we can tell about human evolution. But actually, if you look at experimental evidence and other stuff, you see that actually testosterone is involved in all sorts of behaviors. It's involved in what we might call antisocial behaviors, maybe if we wanted to, but also pro-social behaviors.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I spend quite a lot of time in the book actually saying, look, like this is a there are a series of myths that we need to dispel, and one of them is that just testosterone is about aggression. And actually, you look at a study of gerbils, for example, and you find that administering testosterone to gerbils, to male gerbils in particular situations, will make them behave in different ways. So it will either make them be more attentive to female gerbils and to look after them, or it will make them more aggressive to to like a gerbil that's been inserted into the gerbil nest or
Yeah, an
whatever, as an
unfamiliar gerbil.
outsider. Yeah, so it's kind of like it actually in many respects appears to be like a kind of context dependent
Right, right.
hormone, and depending on in-group, out-group situation, it can elicit different kinds of behaviors in animals. But one of the most important ways, actually, I think, that you can look at testosterone and its effects, particularly in humans today, is to look at what happens to men who have a diagnosis of low testosterone.
Hmm.
And an important part of the book is I actually talk about low testosterone, the symptoms of low testosterone. What does having low testosterone do to a man? Well, basically, it makes him totally useless. I mean, if you have like chronically low testosterone, if you have a low testosterone diagnosis, you will be anxious, depressed, without motivation, without libido. You'll probably put on weight. You might develop man boobs, gynecomastia. You might lose hair, lose your hair. You might, all sorts of pretty, really awful things happen. And there are sub forums on Reddit, low testosterone sub forums, full of these kind of agonizing testimonials about actually what it's like to be a man with low testosterone. And I draw quite heavily on them in the book, basically to make the case that, look, I mean, uh, testosterone is what makes men men. And yes, men need estrogen, and yes, women need testosterone, but it's specific ratios, and men need much more
Right,
testosterone than
right, right.
estrogen, and women need much more estrogen than
Yeah.
testosterone.
One of the things I
Um,
wanted to emphasize here is, the cartoon of testosterone is more testosterone is going to basically mean more aggression and antisocial behavior.
yes.
But as you said, as with anything else we could talk about in biology, everything is context dependent. The
Mm,
testosterone levels will modulate behavior, including aggressive
mm,
and social behaviors.
mm,
But the way it does that, the direction it does that is going to be highly dependent on social context, on the
mm,
conspecifics or fellow animals that are around
mm.
the animal in question. And importantly, I want to emphasize for people that you can actually increase aggressive behaviors by boosting estrogen. We know that's true in
Yes.
animals. You can stimulate
Yeah.
estrogen receptor neurons in the hypothalamus, and this will literally
Mm,
make mice attack other mice. It's probably involved in the transition to motherhood
mm.
in females, right? Think of the concept of
Yeah.
the mama grizzly becoming more aggressive. But also,
Mm,
you have some interesting stuff you include in one part of the book
yeah.
around increasing the aggression in primates by changing their
Mm,
diet to estrogenize
yeah.
them, basically.
Yes, yeah. So that's a funny one. So basically, there was this great study that was done in 2004 of male macaques. And what they did was they fed them. So they were observing them in their troops, in their social groups, and they gave them a diet that was high in soy isoflavones. And soy isoflavones are the estrogenic compounds that you find, natural estrogenic compounds that you find in soy products. And what they discovered was that actually doing this basically made the mice into kind of like passive aggressive incel monkeys, basically, is maybe the kind of best way to describe it. It made the monkeys, the male monkeys, simultaneously more withdrawn from the troop. So they kind of,
Hmm.
like became
Hmm.
incels. They sort of withdrew from the troop and didn't engage in social interactions as much. But it also made them more aggressive. So in the instances where they did interact with other macaques in the troop, they were bitchy and attacked them. And it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
so,
So they were
I mean,
more
this is a very,
irritable and less assertive,
mm,
basically. They didn't go and
yes,
interact with the group willingly,
mm,
but when they had to interact with someone,
yeah.
they were basically more aggressive.
Yeah, and so this is, I mean, this is the complete opposite, really, of the testosterone as aggression hormone thesis. You can give male monkeys um, these soy compounds that by the way are in all of these sort of processed soy foods that people eat today. They're in, these soy milk and all this kind of stuff because modern soy products aren't fermented. And this is the difference
Right.
between modern soy products and the consumption of soy historically, is that soy was consumed in small amounts in places like Japan, and it was always fermented
Hmm.
because ferment. I mean, not that they knew that what they were doing was
Right, right. But it
deactivating the soy
turns out
compounds.
that pre-digestion
Mm,
basically gets rid of the
yes,
estrogen-like compounds.
yeah. And so actually, pretty much the only demographic that ever consumed unfermented soy were monks who were looking to, like Buddhist monks, who were looking to basically lower their libido levels and be in better control of their desires.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's actually true. That's actually true.
Wow.
So,
So they would intentionally eat
um,
certain diets to basically
mm,
try and reach nirvana faster.
yeah, I mean, a vegetarian diet does that anyway, and that's something that I talk about in the book too. But yeah, this estrogen thing, is interesting, and it really does kind of, I think, in a funny way and in an engaging way, actually cut to the heart of this kind of testosterone myth. But what you also see actually that I think is interesting in a lot of these studies is you see there are built-in biases, I think, in things like, so a lot of the experiments are social psychology experiments, right? So you get groups of men
Hmm.
and you put either a testosterone gel, transdermal gel on their arm, or you give them a control, so it's a gel, but it's not testosterone. It's just something neutral. And then you get them to do some kind of task that illustrates, let's say, or that explores some kind of virtue or sort of social behavior. Like a lot of them focus on fairness. So they'll
Hmm.
do this, so they'll apply the gels, and then they'll say, like, you play a game where you have to allocate rewards to people, and
I
you
see.
get to choose how to allocate the rewards. And so what they're trying to see basically is whether if you give someone a shot of testosterone, will they be more fair? Will they be less fair? Will they be more aggressive? Will they be less aggressive? Will they be um, more favorable to inequality and hierarchy, or will they be more egalitarian? But what you get with a lot of these studies, and particularly the ones that focus on fairness and egalitarianism, is that, yeah, you'll find that if you give men a shot of testosterone, they're happier with hierarchy. That seems to be a major finding of a lot of these studies, is that actually, you give men a shot of testosterone and actually they're okay with some people getting bigger rewards than others. But what then happens is you get this kind of sleight, well, it's not really a sleight of hand, but it's kind of these built-in biases. I mean, we live in a democratic society, and so what do you do? Well, you say, okay, well, that's antisocial. So
Hmm.
testosterone is an antisocial hormone because it makes men happy with hierarchy and inequality. Well, actually, the vast majority of human societies, I mean, like 99.9% of human societies, have been rigidly hierarchical
Hmm.
throughout history. So,
Yeah. Well, it's like you can see this sort of thing creep in almost any field, but in this particular
mm,
area, it's you can really see it jump out. I mean, just to
yes.
put the similar spin on something from the animal world that I'm familiar with. Again, let's think of the concept of parental defensive aggression, which is perfectly
Mm,
natural and perfectly healthy, right?
yes.
When a
Yeah.
female has babies, whether we're talking about a grizzly bear, a human being, or a mouse,
Mm,
she will become more defensively aggressive, right? She will,
Mm.
famously, little animals will fight much bigger animals off if they've got their
Yeah.
little cubs or nestlings to take
Mm.
care of. And no one would ever look at that and properly understand it and say, oh, that's a negative attribute because aggression is bad.
No.
But effectively, what you're saying is that in some of these social psych experiments, that kind of thing is interpreted automatically in a
Mm.
negative way, even
Yes.
though there's probably a deeper and subtler understanding that should be had there.
Yeah, precisely. But then you'll get much more interesting, more elaborate studies of testosterone in a social setting. Like, for example, there's a study that I talk about where social psychologists went on a hunting trip in somewhere like the Amazon
Mm-hmm.
with a tribesman, right? And they measured levels of particular hormones at particular times
Oh, wow.
before, during, and after the expedition to hunt, right? And so they were able to track how during the hunt testosterone levels rise, right? Because among other things, testosterone encourages competitiveness. It does encourage aggression. It enhances male attributes. It enhances strength, right? But then actually what happens is you have other um, hormones, oxytocin, which is called the love hormone generally for its kind of role in social bonding. When a mother gives birth to a child, her body is flooded with oxytocin, and that really kind of cements the bond between mother and
Yeah,
child,
yeah.
right? It
Coincidentally,
changes the
that's another
brain.
hormone where, yeah, that is everything you just said is true about oxytocin, but it also modulates things like this in-group, out-group distinction. And while it
Mm,
does promote things like bonding with the
mm.
baby, it can promote this kind of defensive aggressiveness and modulate those sorts of
Yeah.
things in terms of how you behave towards others as well. So all of these hormones are, they
Mm.
can't be caricatured as just the aggression hormone, the love
No,
hormone, and so forth.
no. And so in this study of these tribesmen, like testosterone levels increase, but it also pushes at the same time you see a corresponding increase in oxytocin.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's interesting things that happen when they get back to the village and they start dividing the spoils.
Hmm.
So it's much more complicated, and just trying to say, oh well, testosterone is antisocial, and look, 50,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers had much, more prominent brow ridges, and that's because they were living in smaller groups. And now we've got this really complex civilization, and we need to have lower testosterone because otherwise it won't work. That's just like really a gross parody, I
Mm-hmm.
think,
Mm-hmm.
of how we should think about testosterone and its relationship to civilization, its relationship to society, and to sort of man's interaction with his fellow man. Um, and so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of bullshit really to cut through, and I try to do that with like a few really good, really clear studies, like the study of the male macaques, for instance, that
Mm-hmm.
shows like actually estrogen modulates aggression, and you can get animals to behave really aggressively just by giving them estrogen. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's a lot of bullshit to cut through, and these are tropes that are widely circulated throughout society. They're very common. I think if you asked a sort of person of middling intelligence, about testosterone, they would probably tell, yeah, that's the aggression hormone.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
makes men angry, makes men aggressive, and then they might have opinions about what to do about that to make society better.
Yeah. And, people have been talking for some time about the apparent drop in testosterone levels among
Mm,
males over time, over the
mm,
course of the last few decades. What do we actually know there about whether or not that's happening, the extent to which it's
yeah.
happening, and so forth? This might be a good place to talk about the Massachusetts male aging study.
Yes, yeah, that's the big one. So, um, we have very good reason to believe that testosterone levels are actually falling precipitously. Now, um, first of all, we have experimental evidence. So the first big red flag about testosterone in the Western world was this study called the Massachusetts Male Aging Study that was carried out. It's like a gold standard study. I mean, I won't go into the boring details. But it's a really well constructed community study of men of various different ages, from sort of like 18 to middle age in a community around Boston, totally random sample over a period of about 20 years. So what they did was they took a random sample of men from this community near Boston, and they measured biomarkers over time, various different biomarkers. But one of the principal biomarkers they measured was testosterone. And what they showed over a period of about 20 years, so this was from I think 1987 until about 2004, I think that was the time frame. So it was like 17 years. It was just under 20 years. But what they showed was a year-on-year decrease of 1% in testosterone levels over that, slightly more than 1%. So it was like a 20% decline in 17 years. So every year, 1%, 1%, 1%, and so on. And, you know, you extrapolate that over a longer period, if that continues, I mean, it's a big, 1/5 in less than a generation is a big decrease. And what they showed as well was not just that it was decreasing within the generations, but between them as well. So it's like a 60-year-old man, let's say in 1987, has like 20% more testosterone than a 60-year-old man in 2004.
Hmm.
So that was a big sort of wake up call, I think, about uh, testosterone levels, and it inspired some other studies that wanted to test the hypothesis of to test the findings and see whether actually is this being repeated elsewhere in the Western world, or is this just something that's confined to America or even just to Boston, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So there was a so the analysis of the Massachusetts male aging study, I think that was kind of like 2007, I think that the testosterone paper came out. And then a year or two later, there was a paper out of Finland where they looked at Finnish men. And they actually had they had a longer data set, I think. But the hypothesis there was, okay, well, we're not going to see this in Finland because generally men in Finland score higher on tests of reproductive health, various different tests
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
reproductive health than American men. Like there are fewer instances of undescended testicles, of cryptorchidism, and there fewer men in Finland get prostate cancer than men in
Mm.
America. So they were like, okay, we're not going to see this. But actually, it was exactly the same over a longer period of time. In fact, actually, I think it was slightly worse, and that's why. So that was a
Hmm.
big thing.
Hmm. Yeah, and
Um,
there's been at least one or two more in other parts of the world, and I guess
is
punchline here
Israel
is,
Israel is
yeah,
Israel is one of them where they did one. Yeah.
we've been seeing this for some time, different parts of the world, different
Mm,
cultures, different
yeah.
populations. So it seems to be a general purpose phenomenon that's happening.
Mm,
This brings us to the question of what's driving it. It can't be something that's only in the U.S. and not in Finland because we're seeing the
mm,
pattern in both places.
yeah.
Do there's multiple things we could talk about here, but let's talk about strict biological causes of what might be
Mm,
driving this. This gets us into the discussion of endocrine disruptors and
mm,
food. Those two things go hand
yeah.
in hand. The stuff we're putting on and in our bodies. What do we know?
Mm.
Just give us the broad strokes here about how that ties into some of the hormone biology.
So I suppose actually one thing I want to say about those studies is that there are various subtleties to measuring testosterone, right?
Hmm.
And your testosterone levels as a man and testosterone levels as a woman will fluctuate over time,
Yes.
not only during a day, but during a month, and actually even during a year. So, we've seen studies that show seasonal variations according to levels of sunlight
Right.
in male testosterone levels. So, one of the principal criticisms of these studies uh, by people who want to try and say, well, okay, I actually know this isn't happening, is you haven't controlled for all of the variables in testosterone variation. So can you be certain that that even within the Massachusetts male aging study, that over that period of 20 years, the values are comparable because you were taking testosterone levels readings at exactly the same time,
Right. Right.
and or in the same way. And there are all sorts of small things that can lead to quite significant variations in testosterone. So if you get like 4 or 5 days of bad sleep,
Right.
your testosterone levels can fall 15, 20%.
Right. Right.
Um, So that yeah, there are these variables, and it introduces a certain amount of uncertainty. But what we also have is we also have a broader collapse of male reproductive health,
Right, like
and
sperm
this
quality
is
and things like this.
sperm quality, which is how well sperm can swim and whether they can actually fertilize an egg. Sperm quantity as well, sperm counts. That's
Hmm.
just the
Hmm.
sheer number of sperm that are in a particular volume of semen. Yeah, male reproductive parameters, full stop, across the board, have gone off a cliff. So we've also got a corresponding nosedive of about 1% per year, cumulatively year on year, in sperm counts as well. And so um, it's incumbent on the critics to explain why, if men's testicles aren't functioning properly, if men's testicles are breaking down at such an alarming rate and not doing what they should be, why that wouldn't also lead to a testosterone decline as well.
Right.
And I think obviously it would. And so I think that, I think that whatever uncertainties there might be about some of the measurement methods, and whether you're getting like the strictest possible,
Right. Did you
uh,
measure it in the winter early on in the study, in the summer later, and so forth?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And did you make sure that they'd all had a good night's sleep and all this kind of
Right, right,
stuff?
right.
And
But the
but
point is,
no,
all of these measures of male reproductive health are going in the same direction, which is down. And,
yes,
the
big
Massachusetts
time.
study, for example, barring some of the potential criticisms there, it's quite a drastic drop from the beginning of study to the
Mm,
end. So a
yes.
number of confounders would have to line up in the right way to explain
Mm,
that. And
yeah.
also, we can just sort of look around and also not forget to use our common sense here.
Mm. Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, so I'll get back to the endocrine disruptors in a second, but um, uh, I talk about this phenomenon of the hikikomori in Japan, right, which is extreme social recluses.
Hmm.
Now, this is a huge thing in Japan, right? Millions of men essentially are checking out of society and becoming recluses. They're basically just staying in their bedrooms all day, playing computer games and eating fast food, right? And
Hmm.
it's such a bad phenomenon that it has a name, hikikomori, and the Japanese government talks about it. And um, there was a study that showed that, and I talk about this in the book, that these hikikomori, these extreme social recluses, uh, are more likely to have low testosterone, right? So there is a correlation between social withdrawal in among Japanese men and testosterone levels. So yes, I mean, yeah, we can open our eyes and look around as well, and what we see is we see, you know, proliferation of behaviors associated with low testosterone, including this kind of male withdrawal from society. It's estimated that there are something like 6 million men in the US who've basically dropped out of society. And this is associated with low testosterone. And so I think that overall, the overall impression is obviously that testosterone levels are declining. Now, the causes. So, endocrine disruptors. So, endocrine disruptors are hormone disrupting chemicals. There are natural endocrine disruptors. We talked about the male macaques. We talked about soy isoflavones. There are natural endocrine disruptors, plant compounds, natural compounds in the world. But we've created a world now of industrial chemicals, plastics, deodorants, fragrances, pesticides, herbicides. And it turns out that a great many of these artificial compounds disrupt our hormonal systems,
Mhm.
basically. Uh, these compounds are ubiquitous. We can't really get away from them, and this is something that we're learning with microplastics in particular, which is like an emerging field of study, and or an emerging topic of study, and an emerging threat. I mean, we're really starting to get worried about the extent of our exposure to plastics and our inability to get away from them, because they fall in snow and they're at the bottom of the ocean and they're floating around in the air, and they're in household dust and in the bottled water and food. Um, but yeah, so we are exposed in a pervasive way, in a way that has never without is basically without parallel in human history. We're exposed to these harmful hormone disrupting chemicals, and it seems to be a kink, a very strange and unfortunate kink of the modern world, that so many of these, maybe the majority of these hormone disrupting chemicals, mimic the hormone estrogen, right?
Hmm.
So they interfere with the body's natural balance of hormones, testosterone to estrogen, and skew it in favor of estrogen. So that has all sorts of effects. I mean, it decreases testosterone, um, uh, and it can have transient effects, but it can also have permanent effects.
Hmm.
And so this is what's so insidious and so bad about these chemicals, is that exposure to them at particular points in your life cycle, from the moment of conception, can actually have permanent effects. So,
Hmm.
a mother who has higher levels of endocrine disrupting chemicals in her body when she's pregnant, that can have serious developmental effects on her child. It can lead to things like reduced IQ. It can lead to a propensity for obesity. It can lead to uh, developmental defects. Uh, like, so you have a boy who's born with a smaller penis or with undescended testicles. Um, uh, there are even suggestions that it could be linked, because of uh, it could actually be linked to the rise of transgenderism, for example. So I actually talk in the book about the Alex Jones gay frogs conspiracy theory, where he was roundly mocked for suggesting that chemicals in the water could turn amphibians, turn frogs gay. But actually, there are reams of evidence that actually link exposure to endocrine disruptors to serious reproductive defects, and also even potentially gender dysphoria. Um, and so, I mean, this is like it's an it's really an emerging field. It's only something that
Yeah.
we've really started to take
Yeah.
seriously probably over the last sort of 20 or 30 years, but it's becoming very clear that actually we're swimming in a toxic soup, and it's having serious, serious effects on our health. And it's probably linked to every single one of the kind of prevailing chronic diseases of modernity.
Right. Right.
Probably linked to heart disease, probably linked to dementia,
Yeah.
probably linked to diabetes and obesity, but it's also linked to severe reproductive
Right.
problems.
Right. And part of the point here for me is when we talk about hormone biology, what people need to understand is hormones by definition are substances that act throughout the body, and
Mm,
they are specifically substances that coordinate changes and orchestrate
yes.
coordinated change throughout tissue systems of the
Mm,
body. So you're not
yes.
going to get isolated minor problems by messing with hormonal
No.
systems across development. The entire purpose of these substances is to orchestrate literally the construction of the organism
Mm,
into its natural form. And even
mm,
though we can't study all of the thousands and thousands of endocrine disruptors, we know specific ones have very dramatic effects on sex
mm.
typical behavior, neural development, and so forth in animals.
Yeah.
And it's basically just impossible that these things aren't disturbing development of human beings, broadly speaking.
Yes. Well, I mean, so we've got population studies of humans where we can see, like correlations between, for example, levels of plasticizer chemicals like phthalates or BPA with obesity or
Right,
diabetes
right.
or sperm count or testosterone levels in particular. But what we've also got as well is we've got these intervention lab studies where you can actually, because obviously you can't administer these chemicals to people
Right.
deliberately. You can study you can study people out there in the wild, and you can see what level of these chemicals they have, or levels of these chemicals they have in their bodies, but you can't use people as lab rats. So you have to use lab rats, right? But we have these intervention studies. We have these frog studies, for example, that famously showed that administering the herbicide atrazine, which is sprayed in millions of gallons a year
Hmm. Hmm.
all over the US, applying atrazine to the larvae of African clawed frogs could make them switch gender. So you can turn a male African clawed frog larva into a female African clawed frog, and it will then be able to mate with a male frog. So you can literally switch a frog's gender simply by exposing it to atrazine while it's developing, and then it becomes a female rather than a male, and it can produce viable eggs that can be fertilized and produce other frogs. I mean, there are reams and reams
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
studies on this. I mean, there's thousands and thousands and thousands. I mean, it's established beyond any credible doubt that these chemicals uh, in intervention studies have tremendously harmful effects on animals, and in these epidemiological population studies, that exposure to them is correlated with basically every single kind of chronic disease
Right,
you can
right, right.
imagine.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, I've done a number of podcasts on some of these in particular. So there's lots of details we can point people to. BPA in
mm,
particular has been studied. We
yeah,
know it can lead to an exaggerated insulin response. We know it can disturb both the mother and the child when she's exposed during a pregnancy. And so we
mm,
know this stuff is having profound metabolic and neurodevelopmental effects. What what can you tell us about sort of the history of how, so even before the advent of synthetic chemicals and before we had
mm,
Dow chemicals and entered the true the modern era,
yeah.
deeper back in history, what were some of the ways that diet was used to control people?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I talk in the book. I pick up some threads from my previous book, The Eggs Benedict Option. I talk about there's this fascinating, really fascinating short section of Plato's Republic, book two of Plato's Republic, where Plato's Socrates basically says that you can create an ideal, harmonious society that you could control perfectly if you just made everybody have a vegetarian diet, basically. So if you deprive the workers in a society of meat and animal products, you give them a grain diet and peas, and they can have some cheese and olive oil and blah, but no meat, no fish. Um, uh, then basically they're perfectly happy with their lot. They won't rebel. They'll be fearful of authority, and everything will be fine in society. But if you allow a society to have meat, then people's passions get inflamed. And what
Hmm.
what Plato is actually having Socrates say there is he's saying, look, meat encourages thymos. Basically, that's what he's saying. He's saying, you eat meat, you get thymos,
Hmm.
basically. So Plato was the very first social planner. He's the earliest social planner that we really know of. In Plato's Republic is really the first kind of detailed philosophical attempt to lay out a kind of utopian vision of society, right?
Hmm.
And yet you've got Plato's Socrates actually saying, like, if you want an ideal harmonious society, don't let people eat meat. And that's very striking. So, it's 2,300 years ago. There was a there was actually an understanding, and I don't think Plato was being ironic when he
Hmm.
put those words in Socrates' mouth. I think there was a genuine understanding that actually that is diet determines people's behavior. You
Hmm.
can have profound effects on a society. You can create a different kind of society if you alter its dietary habits. And one of the kind of hallmarks of my work that I talk about a lot, that I talked about in the Eggs Benedict option, my previous book, and I talk about in a chapter in this book too, is that actually, um, you really can alter people's hormonal profiles and therefore their behavior simply by altering the amount and type of fat that they eat, whether or not they eat red meat, the kind of protein that they consume, whether they consume animal protein or plant protein. And of course, today we've got this big plant-based agenda where, we're all being told we've got to abandon animal foods, we've got to give up meat, we've got to give up butter, we've got to give up all forms of dairy, and we've got to adopt a diet that's rich in grains and soy protein and other legumes and stuff like that, and these alternative proteins that are being grown in bioreactors, lab-grown meat, that kind of stuff, cultured and fermented foods, and this kind of stuff. And I think that is a contemporary illustration, really. It's a continuation, actually, of what Plato Socrates is saying in the Republic, which is that actually, you want to make a fundamental transformation to society. Well, why don't you change the diet? And there are all sorts of studies that show, for example, that height is correlated with the type of protein that people eat. So this is something that I talk about in the book. There's a worldwide study that shows that societies that eat red meat and drink milk produce the tallest people in the
Right,
world.
right.
And then societies that derive most of their protein from wheat. So that's like Middle Eastern societies, in particular, and parts of North Africa. They're shorter. And then societies that derive most of their protein from rice, in particular, so it's tropical Asia. They're the shortest people in the world.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, I mean, there's a deep history, I think, going back to Plato, going back to, in fact, even going back even further. You could look at the agricultural revolution. You could look at the effects of the agricultural revolution. That's the transition from hunter-gathering to sedentary farming. You can look at the archaeological records, skeletons. You can look
Right, right.
at the skeletal
Yeah.
record, and you can
It was
see that
striking when I
actually.
first learned that,
Hmm,
when sedentary agricultural societies first developed, there were immediate changes in the skeletal
yes.
morphology and the general
Hmm,
health that we saw that those people have.
yeah.
And in general, they got smaller and sicker.
Yes, yeah, I mean markedly, I mean the transition. And so that actually, now that we kind of understand that a lot better, it throws the agricultural revolution into a new light, and it makes us ask different questions about the agricultural revolution, because we are, as a society, as a civilization, we are a product of the agricultural revolution. And so typically we've looked back on the agricultural revolution as this great watershed moment in history, made us who we are. It was the birth of civilization. It allowed the creation of complex culture, of urban centers, commerce, the arts. All the great things that we take for granted were a product of the agricultural revolution. And that is true in some sense. That is true in some sense. But it makes us look back, with hindsight, in basically through the wrong end of the telescope almost. And so what we end up doing is we end up saying, well, actually, of course, our ancestors wanted to transition from life as hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists, because of course it's better. Look what it's brought us. But actually, if you look at the skeletal record, if you look at various forms of other evidence, it looks like life in early agricultural settlements was hell, and people were much, much worse off in a number of different ways. They were less free, and they were less healthy.
Mhm.
And so then you have to ask, well, actually, so what
Why did
was
they
it
do
that,
it?
why did they do it?
Yeah.
And the answer actually looks like, well, maybe they were coerced in
Right.
various different ways. Maybe there was a confluence of various different things that all happened at once. So there's climactic data, for instance, that suggests that perhaps the kind of wild game and animals that hunter-gatherers were hunting became less numerous. And maybe they were overhunted as well. But then you also have other evidence that suggests that maybe, like what you have is actually you have basically outside populations enslaving groups of hunter-gatherers and making them become agriculturalists. So there's abundant evidence that, the first agricultural settlements were built basically on unfree labor, slavery in particular, and that actually, the first forms of warfare between the early agricultural cities, the great cities of Mesopotamia, Ur and Uruk and Lagash and all these other communities, what they actually were was slaving raids. So
Mm.
these cities,
They were
when they went
fighting
to
over
war,
people to use for slaves to
yeah,
do the farming.
yes, yeah, and so yeah, so I mean, like, that's a fundamental transition. You go from a hunter-gatherer mode of living, groups of maybe 150 people max, moving through the landscape. They might be sedentary at some time, like they might have camps where they wait for the migration of gazelle or something, or some kind of game animal, but they were moving and following their prey, multiple food webs, multiple ecosystems. And then you have a transition to fixed field farming, to a much narrower diet, to a reliance in particular on grains, on
Hmm.
cultivated, domesticated grains, small number of foodstuffs, and some domesticated animals. But that was a fundamental transition, and it had fundamental social and biological effects as well. So there's some very interesting stuff, very interesting research being done now into ancient DNA. And what they're doing is they're looking at the skeletons of the first farmers, the first people who lived in these agricultural settlements, and they can extract their genetic data, from the bones, and they're looking for particular genetic adaptations to uh, life as a farmer,
Hmm.
and comparing them to hunter-gatherer skeletons and seeing, like, what are the genetic differences. And what they're finding is that there are the kind of changes that we might expect. So there are changes, for example, to carbohydrate metabolism.
Yes.
So you'll find the early farmers have these, they might produce more amylase in their mouths, let's say, or something like that, or in their gut, or both, to help them digest the carbohydrate, because they're eating a much more carbohydrate heavy diet. But then you're also seeing as well what's interesting, and I mean, this is research that only just, it's really cutting edge, it's
Yeah.
only
Yeah.
really just starting to be done. But you're also seeing that there are behavioral changes as well, or there are genetic changes that indicate behavioral changes. So there was a paper called something like Genomics of Stone Age Eurasia or something,
Hmm.
huge paper.
Yeah.
And just in passing, it mentioned the fact that early agriculturalists appear to have possessed genes that are related to behaviors associated with anxiety, for
Yes.
example.
Yeah.
And that might have something to do with, let's say, like the increased levels of conscientiousness that are necessary
Mm.
to live
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
much larger scale civilization than before. So,
Right.
you go from living in a group of 100 people to living in a city like Ur, which has a population of 50,000. I mean,
Right.
that's an
It's a
enormous,
very different
enormous
psychosocial
change.
environment in addition to a different food environment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's fascinating
Yeah.
stuff, and no doubt there will be a lot more papers on this kind of stuff that
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
start to
Yeah.
show the kind of biological, hormonal adaptations, physical
Right.
adaptations that took place as a result of this
Yeah. Yeah.
fundamental
And
transformation in the way
and
that people ate.
for those who don't know, there's, I mean, you might say we're in kind of a golden age of ancient genomics, recent ancient genomics from, the times that we're talking about now, the
Mm.
transition to agriculture and afterwards. I've had people like S.K. Villersev on to talk about
Oh,
metabolic
nice.
adaptations and things like that.
Mm.
Fascinating stuff. David Reich from Harvard. There's lots of studies out
Yeah.
there, and I think the key thing here is when humans transitioned to agriculture and then things kept going from there, it wasn't just that our carbohydrate and our seed oil metabolism genes changed. There are
Mm.
many, many genetic changes that were positively selected, meaning they had a survival advantage. Clearly, they
Yeah.
had to do with everything from brain development and social behavior to,
Mm.
hardcore metabolism and basically
Mm.
everything. In the time we have left, Charles, I want to ask you to sort of tie some things together here for us. So
Mm.
we've got this, what we'll just call toxic environment that's having clear hormonal and
Mm.
biological effects, both from the diet per se and the toxins and things we're exposed to in the
Yeah.
food, in the water, and all the rest.
Mm.
We've also got, right, psychosocial changes that have happened in
Mm.
concert, which are giving rise to all these phenomena that you talked about,
Mm.
the Japanese recluses, the incel phenomenon here. We've got clear decreases in virtually every marker of reproductive health that you can
Mm.
imagine. Your focus is on men, but you also say that all of this stuff is obviously impacting women as well. In just a
Mm.
couple minutes, can you talk a little bit about female birth control and the effects that's had? Because people often don't
Mm.
appreciate that it's having very strong effects
Mm.
beyond what it's meant to affect.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the birth control thing is again, it's a live issue and it's a hot issue and it's one that people are scared to talk about. Actually, it's and I mean, if you go on TikTok or whatever, then you'll see these sort of videos where girls say, "Look what happened to me when I went on birth control. Look how much weight I put on. Look how awful I looked." Um, and that's become quite a trend. But actually, there's been a lot of pushback against that in the media. So, that's branded as a kind of toxic kind of health influencers trying to brainwash girls not to go on hormonal contraceptives. But there are like we've said already, like you interfere in people's hormonal systems, you have fundamental effects on their entire bodies,
Hmm.
right? I mean, you have hormone receptors on basically every cell in your body. Testosterone, estrogen, right? So you don't just have localized effects. Taking a synthetic estrogen as a contraceptive or synthetic female hormone isn't just going to have an effect on your womb. It's going to have effects throughout the body as a woman. So one of the studies, there's a very interesting study that I talk about in the book, which is a recent study that showed that girls and women who go on hormonal contraceptive experience thinning of a particular part of the brain called the what's it called? The prefrontal
I think it's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex.
ventromedial prefrontal cortex. That's it. Yeah. And so they did MRI scans basically, and they showed that, yeah, if you go on the hormonal contraceptive, it thins the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Well, what does the ventromedial prefrontal cortex do? It's involved in fear regulation and emotional processing. It's involved in executive control, related to emotions. Uh, and what happens as well, what they also showed, I think, if I remember correctly, is that if you go on hormonal contraception as a teenage girl, as so many girls do now, and they go on it not only, not to get pregnant, but also actually because for acne control, it's a matter of course. Millions of girls get put on hormonal contraceptives as a matter of course. But what happens is if you stay on them past a certain age, you can come off and the thinning that's taken place in the brain never goes away.
Yeah.
But what they showed is that actually, if you go on hormonal contraceptives, I think past the age of, let's say, like 25,
Yeah.
you can come off them and
Yeah.
the brain will that
Yeah.
region will regain its
Yeah.
mass. It
Yeah.
will be the
And this
same
is,
size as it should
yeah,
be.
this is, to me, this is very unsurprising. And this is a common thing that
Mm.
you see in biology. If you expose someone to such an intervention at a critical stage of development in a
Yes.
sensitive period, whether it's early childhood
Mm.
development or in
Mm.
utero, or even the pregnancy of a woman, the woman herself goes into a kind of reopened
Yes.
sensitive period. Things can get locked into place and become permanent.
Mm.
Whereas if you wait until those
Mm.
sensitive periods are over or
Mm.
finish developing, then things can be reversible.
So look, so tens of millions of women, I mean, I like hundreds of millions of women worldwide are on hormonal contraceptives and they're thinning their brains. They're actually thinning this critical region that's involved with emotional processing and fear regulation and executive control. Surely we would expect there to be aggregate social effects as a result, right? But what happens? Well, actually, in the paper itself, the researchers say, "Oh no, look, this is worrying, sure, but let's not jump to any conclusions about the potential social effects. Let's not get to worrying about, whether actually this we might be creating a society of women perhaps who um, display aberrant behaviors. Maybe, like." I mean, that's an obvious route to explore then, is like how do women who have a thin or a thinned or thinner ventromedial prefrontal cortex, how do they behave? Like, I mean, I would anticipate not only that they would behave different in a social setting,
Yeah.
they would behave different sexually, probably. They
Hmm.
might have different
Yeah.
sexual choices, and that they might even behave differently politically. Like we're talking executive function. I mean, emotional
Right.
regulation is that's not peripheral.
That's
That's
I mean, in
centrally
many ways, that's
important.
what this part of the brain does. I mean, the reason
Yeah.
our prefrontal cortexes are famously enlarged in humans, a lot of it is tied up with
Mm.
the types of social cognition we need to live
Yeah.
in social groups as we do.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I would say, look, like, yeah, we got to do some research on this, and actually, maybe we've got to caution certainly teenage girls against taking hormonal contraception like this because this is really worrying. But it's a live issue, it's a very live issue because it touches on, well, the hormonal contraceptive was a fundament is was a decisive intervention in endocrinology in the 20th century, and it is associated with women's liberation, right? It is a central plank of women's liberation that they should have total control over their reproductive system. Otherwise, they're enslaved to men and, they're enslaved by the patriarchy, whatever. So this is a very, very emotive issue, like
Yeah.
telling women whether or not they should take the hormonal
Mm,
contraceptive,
yeah.
depriving them of their
Yeah.
reproductive
But it's
freedom.
I think it's important just to recognize like we can be
Mm,
totally agnostic about what's good, what's bad, what we should or shouldn't do. This is a hormone therapy. I mean, we're disrupting
mm,
the hormone system on
yeah,
purpose for its birth
yes.
control effect. But
Mm,
to think it's very very naive to think that it's not going to have other effects as well, and we should at least be
yeah.
mindful of that.
Yeah, well, and this is the thing. I mean, this is what these TikTok videos are about of girls saying, look how fat I've got. It's they're saying, look, I thought I was taking this contraceptive pill and that would all be great and that I would just, I wouldn't get pregnant and I could just live my life and be happy, not worrying about being pregnant. But actually, it ruined my life. It ruined my health and it ruined my happiness. And nobody told me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, that I think is the real crime is that actually it's being treated like it's just oh, it's just a pill and you take it and everything's fine and you don't get pregnant. No, it's a decisive intervention in your body's hormonal balance,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, it can have devastating effects
Yeah.
and effects that we don't even understand yet because actually we haven't prioritized. Um, Investigating them because we're so drunk on this sort of language of personal freedom and personal liberation that we don't actually care to investigate it enough, and also because there are huge profits. I mean, hormonal contraceptives are worth enormous amounts of money to pharmaceutical companies. So then you've also got another vested interest, not only the sort of philosophical feminist vested interest, but also the sheer profit motive. Like there's huge money in this. So it's but yeah, I mean, I think that there's a very good uh there's a very good book. I think it's called something like This is what your brain is like on the pill. I think that's what the book's called. That's about, yeah, I think it's This is what your brain is like on the pill. And it's about all of the side effects of
Mm-hmm.
and then there's another book. I think it's called The Greatest Experiment Ever Conducted on Women or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. Barbara Seaman, and
Mm-hmm.
it's about the history of estrogen and estrogen therapy and how estrogen therapy like was presented as this panacea and it would make women's lives so much better, and actually it's done the opposite and it's actually very dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean we know it's linked to various different forms of cancer, particularly breast cancer. You have these estrogen sensitive breast cancers, but you know the story is it's basically, again, women were kind of sold a lie basically about their health, like you shouldn't go through the menopause. You don't have to go through the menopause. You can take estrogen, you can take hormonal therapy and everything will be fine. But actually that has big risks associated with it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this maybe, in a way ties into, you mentioned at one point William James, this famous psychologist from the
Mm,
early 1900s. He had this notion of humanity being at war with nature. Can you talk about
mm.
that and maybe try and connect it to Fukuyama's thesis and just sort of your general take on that to tie things together here?
So the final chapter is or it's like the epilogue of the book, uh is just about what can we do about, so I've set out this, I've used Fukuyama as a framework, right? And I've said, like, we've created this political system actually that doesn't have satisfying outlets for Thymos. So what can we do? what can we do about that? Like, we can solve these biological problems in some sense. We can clean the environment up. We can get rid of the endocrine disruptors. We can stop people eating processed food. We can get them working out. Um, and that will obviously improve, male health, and it will make men more masculine. But what then can you do about the fact that actually, we live in a society that actually in many ways is fundamentally opposed to basic masculine tendencies and basic masculine desires. Um, so I talk about this essay by William James. I think it's from about 1910. It's called The Moral Equivalent of War. And William James, who was the brother of Henry James, the famous novelist, says, I'm a socialist. I believe in progress with a capital P. I believe in the fraternity of man. I don't like war. I think wars are hugely destructive, and in the modern age, they're only getting more destructive to the point where actually, we could kill ourselves, all of us. But nevertheless, he says, war is the source of a great many virtues, a great many things that actually are useful to society. Courage, the ability to subordinate oneself to a greater purpose, the ability to work within a team towards a common goal. Like he says, the origin of so many of the things that are not only created civilization, but are also necessary even now, even in an advanced society, to its maintenance, um, uh, have their origin in war. And so, what happens if we outlaw war? What do we do? How do we ensure that even if men aren't at each other's throats, killing one another for their nations, how can we still get people to develop courage and all of these other virtues and patriotism? And so he comes up with this idea of, well, okay, we don't go to war with one another, we don't have wars between nations, but what we do actually is we have this grand struggle against nature where we say, okay, we're going to go to war with nature, we're going to master and tame nature, and we're going to send off young men, to kind of get involved in industry and in progress and get them to, build railways and do all these kind of great endeavors to further human civilization and develop these virtues that are so necessary, for civilization to function. Um, and I mean, I think that is the kind of question that I mean, the book ends basically with an open question. I'm like, okay, well, what do we do? Okay, we can solve these biological problems, but what do we do? Do we have to have some great purpose, like William James suggests, in order actually to be fully masculine? If we want something more than just to be consumers, because
Hmm.
that's basically what the last man is. The last man is just a consumer. He's just someone who is happy being a sort of democratic man. You watch your Netflix, you have DoorDash, you work an office job. Life
Yeah,
is
you
pretty
just
flat
buy
and
stuff, but you don't go out and distinguish yourself.
yes, yeah, exactly. Well, what happens then for those of us who actually do want to distinguish ourselves? What do we do? Can we actually do that within a democratic system? And it's not, it's a disquieting thought, and I mentioned the William James essay because clearly it's bothered people before. This isn't a question that I've just hit upon. This is actually, I think, a question that is fundamental is sort of has fundamentally occupied philosophical minds like William James, and Nietzsche and others. What do we do? And Fukuyama too. It's like, okay, we've triumphed, we've created this incredibly complex, advanced
Yeah.
civilization.
What's next? And if the answer is nothing,
Yeah.
what then?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I couldn't have put it better than that.
Hmm. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with, Charles, or anything you want to reiterate from the discussion?
I would just one thing I would like to reiterate again, if I haven't made clear, is that I'm not just saying that it's all about testosterone. I'm not just saying that testosterone is the only thing that matters here. What I think is that biology and hormones in particular have been parodied and neglected to such an extent that we need to reassert the fact that we are biological beings, and that so much of our existence is rooted in our physical structure and our makeup and things like our hormones. And until we understand that, we'll only have a very, very superficial understanding of what's wrong. And something very clearly is wrong. I mean, that's something I set out to establish in the book, is look, something really is wrong. And but we're also looking in the wrong places.
All right. Well, Charles Cornish-Dale, thank you for your time.
That was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. If you like to read like I do, then you should check out the Readwise app. It's totally free to download, and if you go through the link in the episode description or on my support page, you can get a free 60-day trial for zero cost. Readwise is a really cool app that allows you to import digital highlights from over 30 different platforms such as Kindle, iBooks, PDFs, and more. It makes it really easy for you to review and find and share excerpts and quotes from whatever it is that you're reading, whether it's PDFs of scientific papers or books that you're reading on your Kindle. And you can even save and use highlights from physical books. I read a lot of physical books before bed, for example, or when I'm traveling. And the Readwise app actually integrates with the camera on your phone so that you can take a photo of a page that you're reading, highlight a specific chunk of text from that page, and export it to the app so that you can reference it or find it or share it later. They even allow you to export really cool looking graphics of some of the highlights that you have in the books or the papers you're reading so that you can share them in an engaging way. So check out the Readwise app today if you are a reader and you like to reference and organize what you read. Go through the link in the episode description or on my support page or in my free weekly newsletter at mindandmatter.substack.com and try the Readwise app 60 days free today.